Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Jones. I am the Cooperative Extension Agent in Gila County for the University of Arizona. And welcome to this week's edition of the Garden and Country Extension webinar. Today we have Rich Johnson with us, and we're going to learn about how to start vegetable seedlings. So super timely. Rich is up in Payson, Arizona, which is 5,000 foot elevation. So some of us are actually a little behind, but if we're just behind Rich, we're in a good spot. A little bit about these this webinar series. I conduct these weekly on Zoom. I try to keep them at about 60 minutes or less. They're Thursdays at 11. If our speaker has information that goes over an hour, I'm going to release people at the top of the hour, and we'll just keep on with the question and answer. And if we finish early, then we finish early. I've never met anybody who complained about that. We feature a variety of horticulture and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County. If you live outside of Gila County, you're very welcome to be with us and take advantage of these webinars as you see fit. The recordings of these webinars are posted at the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and put in University of Arizona Cooperative Extension, you'll find the website and you'll find the Garden and Country playlist. And we are up to date. Jan's presentation from Tuesday on how to prune a tree is up and live. And the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here is our agenda for today. Thank you for everybody who joined in early and joining on presently. I'm Chris Jones, your moderator. Today we are going to listen to Rich Johnson present about how to start vegetable seedlings. After his presentation, we'll have a question and answer session with Rich, and just feel free to put your questions into the chat box or Q&A as we go along, and I'll feed those to Rich and we'll answer those afterwards, and we'll look to finish up the top of the hour. Here is our presenter, Rich Johnson. He is a Gila County Master Gardener and an Arizona organic gardener for the past 20 years. And I want to bring to everybody's attention, because I imagine you're all gardeners if you're here. Next week, we start hosting the Payson Community Garden spring gardening classes. And so over the next 10, 12 weeks, we will just be focusing in on how to garden vegetables. So stick with us here, share it with your friends, and I think we'll all have great gardens this summer. Rich, I'm gonna pass it over to you at this moment. You can take over the screen, and we are ready to go.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do this, and thank you for all of you folks who have joined in. And I also want to thank Dorothy Howell, one of the High Country Garden Club members, who was my mentor in terms of learning how to start vegetable seeds indoors. So she did a really good job of giving me a bit of an outline to start from, and then I just embellished from there. So we'll get started here then. So starting vegetable seeds indoors, you have to ask yourself, why do you want to start seeds anyway? Well, it's a heck of a lot cheaper than buying plant starts. You can buy a packet of seeds that will cost you anywhere from $2 to $4, and you get a whole bunch of seeds, and compare that to, buying a 6-pack for $3 or buying an individual plant for $3 if it's a little bigger. And if you want to do something even cheaper than that, at the Payson Public Library, we now have a seed library there. And for a donation of 25 cents, you can get a smaller packet of seeds that'll be fine for your backyard garden. Another reason to plant seeds is that you get a lot more control over what you grow. You get to choose the selections and the varieties and not be at the whim of what's going on at the nursery. And some varieties you'll find are not even available at the nursery. So if you want to try something new or different, you may not be able to find it easily, except to go online, and then you're going to have to plant it yourself because you won't be able to get a start. And sometimes, like last spring, sometimes the nurseries have no varieties of sometimes none at all, or nowhere near what you want. And so it's really a nice thing to be able to plant your own seeds and make things happen that way, just like nature does. If you choose an open pollinated group of varieties, then you can save seed from year to year, and the cost will go down even farther. And saved seeds, if you've got them in your storage area, they're always available. So you don't have to worry about whether there's going to be any there in the spring or not. But I have to tell you that planting seeds is not always the easiest way. Some things are easier to grow from starts or sets. And it's that way because either the germination rate is really slow or they just take a long time to grow, whatever the case may be. Herbs, for example, some of those may take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks just to germinate. So it may be easier to start those from cuttings like basil or by division. Onions, on the other hand, might take 5 or more months. So you want to plant those from sets into the ground. And we do that in March here in Payson. So this is an onion set for those of you who may not be familiar with that term. It's just a small onion, basically. Someone else has grown the thing from seed to this point. And this is the way you buy it. Now, obviously, this is a heck of a lot more advanced or farther ahead than a seed. So it gives you a good jump on the season. And these we plant in Payson in March. So some of the things that you're going to need to be planting indoors. You're going to need something to plant into. So you can buy these trays with multi-cell kits that go into it. You can buy those in a 36-cell group or a 72-cell group. And they come with some kind of a dome. Some of them are taller, some of them are shorter to go over the top of it. And of course, you're going to need some kind of a seed planting mix to go into. And as you can see, there are just a huge variety of them. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And you're going to need a place to grow the stuff indoors. So you're going to have to set up a table somewhere. So this is a spare bedroom in my house, and that's a fold-up bed behind this apparatus. And so you set up some kind of a table, and you're going to need that place to be warm one way or another. Either you're going to have to keep the whole room really warm, or you're going to be able to do something else. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, there's one option that you can try, and this is not a really good option for vegetables, but you can try using a sunny south-facing window. The downside to this is that overall, you're not going to get enough light on your seedlings to make this work well, and you're still going to have to do something to keep them warm at night. So this is not the best arrangement. What really does work out extremely well is having grow lights. Grow lights, you get to regulate how much light and for how long during the day that you can apply to the plants. Works out very well. And a heating pad for seedlings is almost a must. If you're going to end up getting quick germination and all that kind of thing, it's going to work out really well for you. These come in various sizes that are small enough to fit one of those trays, like this whole tray apparatus here. You can buy a heating pad that's big enough just for that, or you can buy a really big one like this one, and you can get them with or without thermostats. I've not bought any of the ones with thermostats. I use a very simple one. You plug it in, and that's the end of it. And that has worked out really well for me, so you don't have to spend the extra money on heating pads if you don't want to. You're going to need one, but you don't need a fancy one. Okay. So talking about the timing of the planting. So again, we're here in Payson, Arizona at 5,000 feet. So things are, I'll show our schedule, and I'll also point out some of the lower elevation schedules. So for things like tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, you can plant those indoors in the early to mid-February sort of time frame so that you can plant them outdoors in May. Now in Gysela or in Tonto Basin, where it's quite a bit lower and warmer, you're going to plant those seeds in December indoors, and you'll plant them outdoors in March. Now for your larger seeded vegetables like squash and eggplant, beans, and things like that, early April is a good time indoors for a May planting outdoors. Or what most people will do with these things is you can just wait until May and plant the seeds directly in the ground. Now that's going to be a little slower than if you had started them indoors. So that's why I mention that you can start those indoors in April, but you don't want to start too early on those because they have a tendency to get pretty leggy, pretty lanky, and we'll talk about what that means here shortly. But the main idea here is that you do need to plan ahead. You need to be planning at least 1 to 3 months ahead before you're going to plant stuff outdoors. So you want to start with your trays. So you're either going to use the purchased seed trays, or you can use the 6-packs that you bought stuff from at the nursery, or 4-packs or 8-packs or whatever you got. But one thing you need to be sure of is that for each year, each winter, when you're going to start planting, you want to be sure that you sterilize those things if they've been used before. So you want to soak them in a water bleach solution, 10 parts water to 1 part bleach. And you soak them for an hour or two, and that'll clean those things right up, and it'll prevent a problem that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And if you're going to plant, when you do get around to plant the larger seeded stuff like squash, instead of using those little 6-packs or cell trays, you use a larger pot to start with for the big seeded items. A 4-inch pot is a good one to start with. So there again is the seed trays that you can use. And if you're using the squash or something like that, start them in a larger pot, just like that. Now, the problem with, you need to start, or excuse me, you need to choose a seed planting mix. And as I showed you before, there are just tons of things to choose from. But, and I want to make this point pretty clear, this is not the time to get real fancy. You don't need the castings from Wally, your favorite pet worm. You don't need to be putting all kinds of fancy stuff in there. Seeds do not need much to get going. One of the biggest problems that comes up with a seed planting mix, if you elect to use soil, meaning dirt, real dirt, what can happen there is you're going to end up with a problem that's called damping off. That's a situation where the seedling gets going, everything is looking great, gets up to 1 inch or 2 inch, maybe 3 inches. And then suddenly the seedling falls over and plays dead, and it is dead. So what's happened there is that there's a fungus that has taken over, and the fungus attacks the base, somewhere near the base of the seedling. And it makes the thing turn brown and shrivel up, and the plant just falls over and calls it a day. And so this is the best argument for using either a sterile potting mix, something like coconut coir, that's spelled C-O-I-R, if you're not familiar with it, or any non-soil planting mix. And so you want to be sure that you keep the mix, well, once you get this going, you want to keep the mix damp, but you don't want to overwater it. You don't want it to be too wet, because that's the situation where fungus really get going. And they're going to cause trouble for you if that gets to happening, that damping off problem. Another little trick you can use is in your seed planting mix is you can add some compost to it. Compost has the benefit of having some really good beneficial microbes in there. And they will help keep the bad microbes, like those bad fungi, they will keep them in check as long as you're not overwatering. And here's a really important thing to come to grips with. And it's if you're not familiar with this whole process, it's may not seem all that intuitive, but a seed does not need living soil to germinate. The seed itself does a great job at producing a seedling, as long as it's got a place for its roots to go. And that's where you need a planting mix of some kind, but that planting mix doesn't need any nutrition whatsoever. So that's a good thing to be aware of. Now, some like to start seeds in a regular soil or in pure compost or a mixture of a whole bunch of different things. And I already mentioned, one of the hazards of that, but the benefit to doing it that way is that if your seedling does survive, if it gets past that damping off process and it thrives, when you transplant that seedling into the next pot, if you use a similar soil in that pot, and then when you transplant that pot into the ground, if your bed is a similar soil, there's a lot less transplant shock. And so you can actually get things to happen more quickly when you go from one pot to the next to the ground. Things will happen faster. roots have a really tough time transitioning between different planting mediums. It's not that they can't do it, they do it all the time, but they are slow about it. So you're going to lose a little bit of time if you're changing planting mediums. Okay, so what you're going to want to do once you've chosen your planting mix, whatever you're going to do about that, is put it in a tote or in a bucket or something and add water to it and get it good and moist, uniformly moist. And the reason I mention this and why it's so important is that some of the seed planting mixes that you buy, some of those things just do not absorb water very well at all if they're already in a pot and you're watering it from the top or from the bottom for that matter. They don't absorb water all that well. And so doing this step right here is really important to get going. So once you get that good and uniformly wet, you're going to want to pour it into your planting cells or your pots or whatever you're doing, your 6-packs, whatever, and gently, push it in so that you fill the cell or the pot. And then have it fill up to where it's just below the surface. You want to leave a little room at the top. Okay, so then you're going to have your seed packets, and you're going to check to see how deeply you need to plant something. And there's a good rule of thumb, if you're saving seed, obviously you don't have a seed packet, so you don't have anything to refer to. Now you can probably go online and find something, but there's a really good rule of thumb here that'll tell you right off the bat and make you really close. You plant your seeds to a depth that is 2 to 3 times the width of the seed. So if you have a small seed, like let's say it's a 1/16 of an inch wide, you're going to plant that seed between 2 and 3/16 of an inch deep. It's really simple. If you've got a larger seeded one, like a bean seed or something, that let's say it's a 1/4 of an inch wide, then you're going to plant it somewhere between 2 and 3/4 of an inch deep. And so it's really simple to figure it out that way. And then once you've planted, and then one other thing, once you've decided how deep you need to plant, use any kind of a pencil or some pointed object to poke a hole in there. And one of the things that's a really good strategy is you want to plant 2 seeds per cell or per pot, whatever. And instead of planting the 2 seeds in the same hole, actually put 2 holes in the cell or in the pot and plant 1 seed in each. That way, if one seed fails to come up at all, the other one does come up, you've got at least one seedling per cell. And that's what you were probably shooting for in the first place. But if they both come up, if you're lucky enough to have them both come up, and it happens quite often actually, then you very potentially can get 2 plants from that one cell, which puts you that much further ahead. So that's basically all you need to do there. Once you've put your seeds into those holes, then you can just gently with your finger, just fill it in with some of the rest of the mix, but do not tamp it down. Don't compress the thing. Okay, now this is very, very important. Be sure that once you have planted, that you have labeled what you did, and don't plant a whole tray worth of stuff and then go back and label it. Plant either a single row in your plant cells and then label it, and then move on to the next row and plant it and label it, and then so on and so forth. Or if you're planting 6-packs or 4-packs, like you can see in this picture right here, you would plant the whole 4-pack and then label it. Then move on to the next 4-pack and label it. You don't want to end up putting tomato seedlings where you thought you were supposed to be putting peppers in your garden when you get ready to go. So be sure that you mark each one. And you want to cover the tray with its dome to keep the soil from drying out. Now you started off with that plant medium plenty moist to begin with. You do not need water in the tray to start with. And so then you can just put that plastic dome over the top. It'll help keep it from drying out for a while. And the seedling the seeds will get started and whatnot. Place the tray in a warm place, preferably on a heating pad. Or you can try, this is what some people do, they'll try to use a grow light as their heating source. Now just imagine these seedlings are not here yet. You've just got the planting tray with seeds in it, and they put the heating, or excuse me, the grow light right down close to it to try to keep it warm. And you can try to do that, and it may work for you, but it may not. So again, I really recommend the heating pads. But one of the main things to realize here is that you do need to keep the light source really close to things. And in this case, we're kind of looking, you're seeing here that you want to keep the light source 2 inches above the seedlings once they're going. Now, it's important to note here that light is not needed to get seeds to germinate. You do not need light to start the seeds to germinating. Once the seedlings start, once they've come up, then you do need light. And that's when you're going to need to be sure you're keeping the light 2 inches above the seedlings. No matter where the seedlings are, 2 inches above the seedlings is very, very important. Now, as the seedlings start to grow and they get pretty well along, you can try putting them in direct sunlight in a south-facing window, and maybe for a couple hours during the day, that might work out okay, but you might as well just leave them where they are under the grow lights and let them go that way. They will do just fine. And again, you just need to be sure that you're keeping them warm at night, and that's what that heating pad will do for you. Now, one of the things that can happen if you don't get enough light, or if you try to use the south-facing window as your only light source, is seedlings will become what's known as lanky or leggy or stringy, all kinds of words to mean the same thing. And you can see these long, skinny, white seedling stems, and all they have at the top is their first set of leaves. And we're going to talk a little bit about leaves here in a second. But these are not healthy seedlings. These are not going to do well for the most part. For almost all varieties, these plants may never do well. So you want to avoid this situation. Now, tomato plants are an exception to the rule, and we're going to talk a bit about that as we move along. But don't be afraid to use lots of light with your grow light. We're talking 16 or more hours a day. Just think of Alaska. They get 20 to 24 hours of light a day during the peak of the summer. So don't be shy with the light. Now, when it does come time to water your seedlings, you don't want to water them from the top. Be sure you're watering the tray from the bottom. So you can lift out one of your little cell sets and pull the thing out and add some water in there. And do not water from the top. Now, once the seedlings have come up and they've touched the top of the dome, whatever dome it is you have, that's a good time to just permanently remove the dome. And again, just keep the thing on your heating pad, keep the thing warm, and keep it cruising along. Keep the light adjusted so that you're 2 inches above the seedlings all the time. Okay, when the seedlings get growing and they get up to a fairly good size, they're going to eventually put on their first true leaves. But let's talk about the difference, or let me mention that at some point there, after they get cruising along there, and so they're putting on their true leaves, or they get to be 3 or 4 inches tall, and they're probably 4 to 6 weeks old at that point, that's when you want to start thinking about transplanting. And that's when you are going to transplant into a regular organic soil. And that's a point where you can enlist your favorite pet worm named Wally and get him to do his thing for you with the worm castings. Okay, leaves. Here's a tomato seedling that is very healthy. Notice how the stems have a little color to them. There's got some purplish color along the way. And they've put out their first leaves. These are not true leaves. These leaves came from the seed. They did not grow as a result of being at the top of the food chain here, at the top of the stem, and putting out new leaves. That's not what happened here. These leaves actually came from the seed. And notice how they're long and slender with no lobes at all. Okay. Now, once the seedling starts growing a little further along, then you get what's called the first true leaves. And that's what these guys are right here. These grew at the top of the stem. These were your first leaves, not true leaves. Notice how there are no lobes, but notice how this does have lobes around it. these are starting to take on the characteristic tomato leaf look. And once they grow a little bit further along, that first set of true leaves gets bigger and bigger. Then it starts putting on second true leaves and thirds and fourths, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's in this, you know, once you start getting along and you get some size to these things and they're starting to bump up against the dome of your seedling thing, or you get 3 or 4 inches tall, you want them to be good and healthy. And these look really healthy, good color and all. That's when you're going to make up your own soil and do whatever you're going to do for that. And if you're going to make your own from scratch, you're going to want to be sure to filter it well. Filter it down even further down than this. This is a 1/2 inch filter. Filter it further down. You want to end up with a fairly fine mixture. You want to make it so the roots aren't having to fight to get around. You want to be able to move through the soil mix very easily. Okay, and before you get ready to transplant, be sure that you've watered your seedling trays or pots or whatever you have, to be sure that the soil is damp, that plant mixture is damp. You don't want it to be dry, because then when you go to transplant it, it'll just fall apart. Do not use seed planting medium to transplant your seedlings into. They do not have the right nutrition, or any nutrition at all in many cases, to allow a plant to grow. So avoid using seed starting medium as your next step. It's great for the seeds, but once you get ready to transplant, it's no good at all. Make sure that your pot is 3 to 4 inches across, and be sure it's 3, 4, 5 inches deep, especially for tomatoes. Now I'm going to focus on tomatoes a lot here because that's what most people like to grow. It's what most people ask about. So we're going to focus on that. One of the neat things about tomatoes, they have some very unique characteristics. They can be planted well below the root ball, whereas most things you don't want to do that with. You don't want to plant a pepper deeply. You can plant a tomato plant deeply, and we're going to talk about that and show some pictures of that real well here. So put 1 to 2 inches of your new soil in the bottom of the cup. And then what you're going to do is you're going to use a spoon. I found a spoon is the absolute best tool for getting seedlings out of these little plant cells. So you can run the spoon straight down along the sides of the cell, and you can go all the way around, do all 4 sides if you want to or need to loosen things up a bit. You can also squeeze the cells right and left, front and back, and even push up from the bottom to get it loose. And then once you've gotten it loosened up, push the spoon all the way down and pry the thing out of its tray there. Now this is what you should end up with. You should end up with a seedling with a root ball, and you can lower this thing gently down into the pot. And if for some reason you do need to handle the seedling for some reason, you want to be sure that you handle it from the leaves. Do not handle it from the stem. Now this person here is just kind of balancing the thing, not really handling it as far as lifting it or anything. But if you handle it from the leaves and you do a little damage, there's really no harm done, because the leaves will grow back. If you damage the stem, the party's probably over on that plant. Those stems are very fragile at this point in the game, and so you need to be very, very careful about that. Okay. Now, unlike some plants like peppers, as I mentioned before, tomatoes like to be transplanted. Peppers don't like being transplanted so much. Squash do not like being transplanted a lot. You're going to end up doing it at least once to get it from your pot to the ground, but a tomato plant really actually likes to be transplanted, and it likes to be transplanted deeply. And what the benefit of that is that when you're going to encourage more root growth, the plant's going to be healthier, and you're going to get greater productivity out of the plant. Now, what do I mean by getting more root growth out of it? Well, you've got roots down in the root ball when you get ready to transplant it. But if you notice here on the stem of the seedling, see all those little hairs? Those little hairs will become roots if you put that down in the soil. So not only will you get new roots and expanding roots down in the root ball, but you're going to also be producing a lot more root up along the stem for the part that's underground. And that ends up working out extremely well for you. And as I said, it produces a healthier plant with a lot more productivity. So here's an example of doing that. The root ball has been put way down in the soil, and a couple of branches have been picked off. Now, if this were me, I would have picked off this branch and this branch as well, and then planted it right up to here. The point is that you almost can't plant it too deeply. So as long as you're leaving, a nice cluster of leaves at the top like this, then you're going to be just fine. A tomato plant can handle that. In fact, actually likes it. Here's another way to get the same thing done. This was a lanky tomato plant, had a long stem, and it had some leaves and branches on it, but it was not the healthiest looking thing, didn't have the best color and all that. All the branches up through here were all picked off, and just this much of it was left above ground. So if your raised bed is not deep enough to be able to plant your seedling into, say it was pretty tall, then you can do it on a diagonal way. And that's another option. Now I'm going to show you a really extreme example of this. 2 winters ago, I brought in my basil plant that was in a big pot and put it in a south-facing window. Basil will not live outside in the wintertime. So I brought it in, and 2 tomato plants volunteered. They just came up and started growing. So I let them go. And again, in that south-facing window situation, with no added light, no added heat, they did not grow into very healthy plants. They grew long and lanky. And so what I did come spring was I brought the thing outdoors, and this 43-inch tall stem from the top of the root ball to the top of the leaves was 43 inches long. I planted the root ball as far down as I could go in my raised bed, and that wasn't far enough. And so then I dug a diagonal trench coming all the way up here and all the way over to here to the place where I wanted the plant to be, where the tomato to be. And I planted it right up to here. Now, this seems kind of odd, but sure enough, just as I was saying before about those root hairs producing roots, all of that ended up producing root. And by the end of the season, this plant was 10 feet tall. The stem where it went into the ground was 1.25 inches in diameter, and it produced a lot of tomatoes. It was a very healthy, good producing plant. So this really worked out really well. Now, one of the problems that you want to avoid when you're growing seedlings indoors or in pots to be transplanted into the ground later is you want to avoid this thing called getting root bound. The plant on the left has got a nice root ball. It's got a reasonable number of roots, a nice number of roots. But the one on the right, notice how it's almost all root showing. Very little dirt is showing there at all. And the roots are just sort of circling around and around and around, and they're not branching out because they had nowhere to go. Well, if you transplant this thing into the soil, even if you plant it deeply, this thing is probably not going to do well because that round and around and around thing is not going to stop. Now, you would think that those roots, now having the full garden bed to grow into, would stretch out, but they don't. And the plant will never end up being very healthy. And that's a big problem for your plants. You're going to wonder why I had these great seedlings and why didn't it grow well in my garden? Well, there's your reason, or could be your reason right there. So what do you do about that? Here's a bigger plant that was let go to be root bound, something terrible. And this is going to be really counterintuitive, and it's going to be very hard for you to do. But what has to happen here is you can take a knife or a pair of scissors, and you need to just slice right through the roots out there on that outside thing. You need to just cut right down through that. So you can see that there's a big slice right here, and there was a big slice right here, all the way down. And on the other side of this plant, there would have been 2 more full-size slices going all the way down through there. And so this is what you need to do to fix that problem. Okay. Now, this is the point where you're doing all this transplanting. This is the point where you find out that those 72 plants that you had in that cell tray, which didn't take up all that much space, well, suddenly now you've transplanted them all into 4-inch pots. That takes up a lot of space. So hopefully you have planned for that. and made allotment for your grow lights to cover that whole area. So you just have to kind of plan ahead on that kind of thing. All right, a few maintenance tips. You want to keep your seed trays watered from the bottom, but don't overdo it. You don't want to encourage the fungus to grow. So let them stay moist, but don't overdo it. Water your transplants gently from the top. And when you have a room that you're growing all this stuff in, you've got your seedlings started, and then you did your first transplants, and you've got those in that same room, probably under your grow lights. You want to ventilate that room. So it's easy to do by just taking a fan, leaving the door open to that room, put a fan right in the door, and keep the air blowing through there gently. You don't have to blow a lot, but you don't want the air in that room to become stagnant, because that promotes all kinds of bad bugs and diseases and all kinds of nasty things. And that will happen, I promise you, if you leave that door closed. Another helpful tip here is to pet your plants. And what I mean by that is just gently wave your hand across the top leaves of the plant to give it a little bit of motion. It kind of simulates the wind outside, and it forces the stems to grow more strongly. And that will really help when you're transplanting, because your stems are going to be good and firm, so they're not going to fall over easily. And especially when you're transplanting into the ground outside and you're suddenly put up against real wind forces. You want your stems to be good and tough. All right, a couple of helpful tips. Again, starting seeds indoors is all about planning ahead. And so you need to be, 6, 8 weeks, even, 3 months ahead of time with all your planting and your planning. Very important. Avoid using a regular soil in your starter trays. Regular dirt is going to just encourage problems with that damping off. So don't do that. Lots of planting mixes to choose from that do not have soil in them. You don't need nutrition to make a seedling start. Do not plant the seeds too deeply. You would think that, deeper is better, but it's not. The seed is either not going to make it to the surface if you plant it too deeply, or it may just rot in the ground down in there. And be sure to label everything. You've got to keep things labeled really well. And use a lot of care when transplanting. Get as much of the root ball as possible. And the seedlings need lots of light, lots and lots of light, and they need warmth. So a heating pad is really a good thing to have. And be patient. Some seeds take a little longer than others to germinate. For example, a pepper plant will most likely be slower than a tomato plant. So don't give up on your stuff too early. A few more tips there. A couple of weeks before you want to be transplanting outdoors, you want to harden off your plants. That's the process where you take your seedlings, which are in pots by this time, not in those little trays probably, and bring them outside and leave them in the sun, or preferably filtered sun, the first day for maybe an hour. And you'll probably notice that they wilt a little bit. That's pretty normal. They can't handle the intensity of the sun. They've not had that kind of intensity, and suddenly you throw them in there. If you just put your plants out in the garden right from underneath the grow lights, they're going to die. You need to harden them off. And so bring them out the first day for maybe an hour, bring them back in. Bring them out the next day for a little bit longer, and then each day a little longer and a little longer, so that after 2 weeks, you want to be able to have those plants out there for a full day. You want to be able to leave them out there all day through right in direct sunshine, and they will be ready to transplant at that point. Don't plant outdoors before the weather has warmed up. And of course, you've got wherever you live, you have your last frost date, kind of use that. And of course, every year is a little different. So do what you need to do as far as that goes. But if you are early, or if you plan to be early, you have to plan to protect your plants at night. And there are a couple of different things you can do about that. You can put a frost cloth over them and put a light bulb under there to help keep them warm. Or you can use some things that are called walls of water. And I'm going to show you what that is in just a second. Starting plants indoors requires a lot of light. Don't be shy with the light. Have I mentioned light yet? Light is really important. Now, here are these things called walls of water. I use these things every spring. So here, what this is a bunch of plastic tubes all made into one thing. So here's a plastic tube right here. And then here's another one right here. And another one right next to it. There are 24 of them going around the perimeter of this thing called walls of water. And the thing naturally closes into this teepee shape. It'll be at full diameter at the bottom, but it'll sort of fold in on itself a little bit and make a teepee looking thing. And it does that all by itself. It has no support structure. It's just you put your seedling in the ground and you put this thing on around it after you filled up these little tubes with water. And during the day, the sun shines through and it gives plenty of light to do photosynthesis for the plant. And it heats up the water in those tubes all at the same time. So that at night, when the sun goes down, you've got a lot of warmth there. And that warmth keeps the plant warm and the ground that's immediately around the plant a lot warmer than it would have been if this wasn't there. Now, obviously, by the morning time, that water is going to be cold. But I have done side-by-side comparisons with this thing a couple of times, couple of years. And every time, the plants inside those walls of water will grow faster and bigger than any of the others. So that's all I have for my presentation there. So if you have any questions, this would be a good time to do it. I'll stop sharing right now.
That's great, Rich. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I enjoyed that. I learned a lot. And I'm going to encourage people to put some questions into the chat and Q&A. And in the meantime, I'm going to pull up a little poll here. Let me see, launch. And if people could just take a moment to just let me know how you heard about this webinar. Did you get a direct email from me? Was it forwarded by Rich? I guess didn't have Rich's name on there, but I know I got several people sharing these. On Facebook or the newspaper, those are the main ways that I'm promoting these programs. If you got it another way through the chat box, just go ahead and write it in there. Once upon a time, I heard people saw it on Eventbrite, and I'm like, I didn't set up any Eventbrite webinar. But, okay, let me know, and that way I can share it. And if you want to be sure you're on my direct email list for the Country and Garden Extension webinar series, pick the chat box where you can send in a message directly to me, instead of everybody. You can just put your email address in there and I'll get you on the list. So I'll leave that up and let people fill that out. We had a really good turnout today, Rich. We were up over 80 people most of the time. And so that's one of the best we get. And some of the things that I think of, we'll give people a chance to get some questions in here. You're getting, let's think about the tomatoes and peppers, starting them now. They take a long time to germinate, so they're probably just little germinates by the beginning of March, right? They're just little seedlings, they got their dicots out, and then they keep on growing. And then, like you said, you want to plant them out when you're past the risk of freeze. So you're getting them out there in March and taking advantage of your no. So when are you putting them out? And of course, I know you're using the walls of water like you just described. So
we don't actually put them. We don't put them out and into the ground until May. May is the time here. I think May 15th or thereabouts is the alleged last frost date. But a lot of people, depending on the year, a lot of people, like including me, will try to put them out earlier. So I'm shooting for early May, and again, a little protection is a good thing. So that helps out a lot.
So yeah, I've often heard Mother's Day is the thing for Payson, or when you can, it's safe to plant outside. You may still get a freeze, but that tends to be the date.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable there. Again, just be prepared to protect in case things get cold.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll here and let people take a look to where we got it. So about a quarter got it from me, about a quarter got it forwarded to them. That's great. Got a small group from Facebook, got a good chunk from the newspaper, and then people gave me a lot of information in the chat box. So I'll be checking that out. So thank you very much for doing that for me. We've been at this for several months now, and I was kind of excited to get people on. All right, so Rich, I'm going to go back and forth from the Q&A and give people a chance to ask their questions. So Susan's asking, on the tubes, could I buy a big tomato plant and plant it in, say, 2 feet? We're around 2,000 feet, and it gets hot and kills the tomato plant. So I'm not too sure what she means by tubes, but.
Yeah, everything that I showed you in this presentation, I moved up here from Tucson, Arizona. Everything I showed you is what I do down there. Of course, the timing, I adjust that timing wise for Tucson. But everything that I showed you, including the walls of water, I used in Tucson, and it worked really well.
And my experience with people in Phoenix, they're able, and maybe when you were in Tucson, you were growing tomatoes in the winter months. So
no, that was all summertime.
Okay, but some people, but Phoenix is warmed up enough that they're growing their tomatoes in the winter, and it's just.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, so they may be actually starting their tomato starts in August and September and planting out for the winter months.
That could be.
Yeah. Okay, Kathleen Green asks, is there anything you can do for seedlings that have already started damping off?
Yeah, I think once they've hit that point, it's probably the party's over on that. You need to, plant some more and keep them drier, and be sure you're not using soil, dirt.
Yeah, so seldom will they come back from that damping off, and they'll have a weak stem if they do, so it is a real common problem, and Rich really went over, use clean material, water from the bottom. And the light, because that way you're growing a healthy plant, it's not leggy. Have you had much success with corn in Payson? Any special tips?
I have not tried corn here at all, but my neighbor grew it the last two summers in a row and had good luck with it. So that's as much as I can say about that.
I have something from Kim Campbell about the last frost in the Young Hagler Creek area. I think you could go well into June, and Hagler Creek, that you're actually in the creek there, it should be warm enough to get started earlier, but you can get frost, I think, into June up that way.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I guess the elevation is going to be the main thing. And if it's higher, then it's probably just going to be, put back a little farther. Your planting dates will be later.
Okay. And Carol asks, how many hours of artificial light do seedlings need? Sounds like you're leaving it on 24 hours a day.
Yeah, I don't go quite that long, but I'll push it 16 to 18 hours a day. That's how much I run it.
So do you turn those lights off at night?
Yes, I have them on a timer, and they turn off for a couple hours at night, and they start up before I'm up in the morning. They're up and running again, and they run all day long.
And with that heating pad, can you keep them in a cool room, a room without heat, or would that be just too much to overwhelm the heater, the heating pad?
The bedroom that I use, I don't heat. And so, I mean, it's not cold in there, meaning not real cold, but it's going to be, in the high 50s or maybe 60-degree area on its own. And I use the heating pad to take care of the plants, and that does a good job, does a fine job.
Yeah, because sometimes, if you don't heat your room, they can easily be in the 50s and during the winter. So that's great. And Donna asked, do you prepare the soil in the garden before transplanting? And do you sterilize your soil for the garden?
Well, no, you never want to sterilize your garden soil. That needs to be alive, but you do need to prepare it. And my number one go-to ingredient there is compost. You want to add compost to your garden plot every season. So if you plant 2 seasons out of the year, meaning you plant in the spring and then you plant in the winter, I add compost twice a year. If I only plant it once per year, like just for the summer and not for the winter, I'll only add compost once, but I add a lot of compost every time I plant.
Well, there you have it. Okay, so you got a lot of kudos and congratulations here. And Danette wants to know when to start planting onion bulbs. Can we do seedlings?
Yeah, the onion sets, and I showed those pictures of the small onions. You can buy those at the plant fair nursery here. And the planting time in Payson is March. And I can tell you that I've gotten involved with some folks down in Geisela, which is, you know, almost 2,000 feet lower than here. And we've already planted the onions there. We put those in weeks ago. So, you know, that's the timing for that. But March in Payson.
Okay. Where do you purchase your walls of water?
I bought all those down in Tucson when I was there, but I'm seeming to think that I saw them at the Plant Fair Nursery here once, and you can get them online.
Right.
And they last several years. I've had that set for several years, so it's not like it's, you know, 1 or 2 years and they're no good. They do last several years.
Great. Kathleen asks, no. BD, do you recommend using B1 for transplanting?
I don't know much about that stuff. I've never used it. Let's put it that way. And I have a good garden every year, virtually every year. You know, you'll have something that does poorly one year versus another, but in general, I have a good garden every year, and I don't use any of that type thing.
There you have it. Don't buy the product if you don't need it. Kathleen asks, if you have a plastic dome, then your light is higher. How far away should the dome be? How far from the dome should the light be?
Yeah, if you have one of those tall domes, and some of them are tall, I've never actually used those, but if you have one of those, I would put the light basically right on it. It might even be touching, or, you know, if the light bulb's not too hot to, you know, it's going to melt it or something. But again, before the seedling actually comes up, you don't need the light at all. But once the seedling does start, get the light as close as you can get it. So that means right down to the dome.
Okay, yeah, as close as you can get. And those grow lights don't get so warm that they're going to melt the plastic or have any issues like that.
No, I don't have any trouble with the fluorescence. Maybe some of the other ones do, but that's all I've worked with is the fluorescence, and they've worked out just fine.
And they still provide a little bit of heat, so they're good.
A little bit.
Have you had much, did we ask this already? Did you have success with corn up in Payson? Any
Yeah, we asked that one. Yeah, we did that one.
Okay. I don't believe the tomato stem trichomes can become roots or root hairs. The stem would produce adventitious roots from the buried stem tissue directly beneath. So that was our extension agent down in Maricopa, Michael Chamberlain, just pointing out, it's not those little, he called it a trichome, those little pubescent hairs. They actually just shoot out from, anyway, not a big deal. More people tell me where they heard about it. How do the walls of water allow light in for the plant, and do you keep them up 24/7?
Yes, the wells of water will be, once you put them on, as soon as you put your plant in the beginning, you know, if you're planting a little bit on the early side, once you put it on, you're going to leave it on until you're ready to take it off, which is probably going to be a couple weeks later. And the way that the light goes through is it's translucent. It lets the light right on through, and it does a really fine job. The plants inside that thing will grow to be virtually twice as big as the ones right next to it without a wall of water.
Right. And so with those walls of water, when do you put them out in Payson? I imagine you put them out where exactly when you plant your plants.
Yes, especially if I think I'm early, but yeah, again, just to get the plant ahead, if for no other reason, even if you just ignore the cold nights or something, I put them on as soon as I put the seedling in that day.
So that's in May when you're doing the warm season vegetables.
Yeah.
Okay. And Tracy confirms Mother's Day is the rule of thumb for Prescott, but also been putting out early and protecting. So that's good. Got some good gardeners with us today. The recording will be available at the YouTube channel that I discussed earlier, and hopefully soon. So yes, the recording will be available. You'll like this one, Rich. Instead of walls of water, can you use otter pops?
I guess I don't know what those are.
It's those little popsicles that come in the little plastic things. I think we're kidding around here.
Yeah, okay, I guess so.
Linda says she culled green bean seeds to plant last year and culled seed from the plants I got this year. I think she's collecting them. Is there any deterioration of the seed quality from doing this, using seeds from the same plant every year, year after year? Kentucky Wonder pole beans.
No, I think, in fact, I think there's an advantage to doing that. If you're using the same variety and you keep harvesting the seed each year from that, what will eventually happen, and it does take a few years for this to happen, but what will eventually happen is that variety will acclimatize to your environment. And so you should end up with a better variety of bean, in your case, to grow in your environment.
You're doing it. She's doing it just right then.
Yeah.
Good. Do you run the heat pad all the time, or do you regulate that on and off like the lights?
I run the heat pad 24/7. But if you get one of the types that has the thermostat built into it, then that's going to regulate it on, off, on, off, on, off, just to keep it at your set temperature.
And yeah, and if it's a cold room, I think you just keep it on, just like you described.
Yep.
Brassica seedlings, 24 hours of light, question mark. Do they need to process sugars at night? I already have 24/7 on our host of seedlings. So what do you think of your brassicas, your winter crops here?
Yeah, I've never grown the winter crops indoors. I've never started seedlings ahead of time for winter crops. I've always bought starts. This year is the first time that I'm going to do that, this coming winter. So I can't advise on that.
Okay. And so you would advise it's not necessary to grow them indoors, or anyway, well, you do start your broccoli early. So do you just do that indoors? And
oh, okay. If you're just asking when to start the brassicas and that kind of thing, oh yeah, you can start that. You want to start that while it's still warm. There's kind of a rule of thumb with those kind of guys, those varieties. You want to start them warm and finish them cold. So you start them in warm weather, and you want to be harvesting in cold weather. And so last year, this past summer, I planted my broccoli at the end of August, and I was harvesting broccoli at Thanksgiving time. That was when that harvest started, and it did phenomenally well, extremely well. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb. September is probably a more typical time, but it was at the end of August that I did it last year.
and we're going to have Rich back to talk about that in August, so we can get ready for our winter gardens. So I think that's just brilliant. Jane says south side of her house is glass. She has started to treat seeds in trays indoors, 3 feet back from the windowsills. She turns them daily. So Jane's got a good warm site there, plenty of light. So she's doing pretty good. That's good to hear. Leanne asked, what do you use for the bottom of your raised beds?
I don't put anything, just native soil. That's all that's in there. I don't put anything special at the bottom.
Right, just let it go straight to the native earth.
Right. And
if you don't have good earth and you need to build that up, then it still has to drain. So you don't really put anything at the bottom. And Jane points also that her seedlings don't get leggy, so she just has a good site.
Yeah, if your south-facing window if it's more like a greenhouse as opposed to just a plain old window, and a plain old window, you really just get a fairly narrow time frame from about 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. That's when you get really good sun. Well, that's only 4 hours. And the rest of the time is inadequate light, and that's when your plants are going to want to get leggy. So that's why a south-facing window doesn't work super well.
Right. And Kathleen says she got a knockoff brand of Walls of Water and the partitions failed. So be careful. Yeah, don't use your otter pops. Although when they start to break and all that sugar goes in the ground, it probably helps to fertilize the plant. Do Walls of Water on your tomato seedlings produce earlier or just taller?
Both. The plants will be bigger and they're going to produce sooner.
That heat just strengthens them all together.
Yep. They're healthier plants in general. They'll do much better.
And Marion says she's had problems with blossom end rot on her Roma tomatoes. There's a common one. Is there a particular type of calcium that she should be using? Are Tums okay?
For the most part, in our southwestern soils, for the most part, we have all the calcium we need. The biggest problem with blossom end rot, I guess technically it is the fact that it's not getting enough calcium, but the problem is not that the calcium is not there to begin with, meaning it's not in the soil. It is in the soil. The problem is you're not getting enough water to the plant so that the uptake of calcium happens. That's where the problem really comes in. There's plenty of calcium. You don't need to add calcium, unless you've got some, unique circumstance there. So it's really a question of watering.
Keeping that water very even.
And even.
Yeah, don't let it dry out. Don't let it get waterlogged. Just keeping that water even. And so having a mulch top really helps to keep that water from evaporating too fast. And yeah, and Romas are notorious for blossom end rot. So just cut that portion off. You know what? I've got noon. I'm going to run my last slides so that we can finish this up. But as long as Rich is willing to hang out and you're willing to hang out, there's still several questions to go through. You got Rich with us. You ask, you get his knowledge. So let me do that. I'm going to bring those slides up like we're ready to finish it. It'll be good for the recording. And so just want to thank Rich for his presentation today. And I just want to remind people to look into the chat box for the webinar evaluation link. It's up at the top and I put it down somewhere in the middle of those questions, but I can put it in there again, but it really helps me out a lot when you take it really is only 1 to 2 minutes. That's very short. Fill that out, let me know what you learned and other ideas for other webinars. And so I can be using that and helping me to guide this forward. And finally, I want to say what we've got coming up is we've got this great community garden in Payson, Arizona. It's called the Payson Community Garden, of course. And for the past several years, we've been doing a spring gardening class series. And that's been at the church right next to the garden. And so with the COVID situation, we got together and I asked if I could be hosting their webinars this year so that we can continue with our social distancing. And they fortunately said yes. So here every Thursday, February 11 through April 15, we are just doing gardening. It is although it is specific to the Payson Community Garden, I know gardeners are able to glean any good information and adapt it to their site. So you are definitely going to get good information. So next Thursday, we have Glenn McCombs from Plant Fair Nursery out in Star Valley, which is just east of Payson. And he's been in the community for 20, 30 years answering, he knows all about plants. So his topic is wake up your garden. So if you're up in Payson in the cold climate, then you know just how to get those soils ready for your spring gardens. And with that, I'm going to say this webinar is over. And if you need to get going, please do. And if you got a question on the list, then we're going to bring those up and finish out. Is that okay with you, Rich?
That'll work fine.
All right. So back with the Q&As here. Okay, how deep do you plant the onion seedlings?
Okay, those onion sets, they only need to go down to where you've got the bulb in the ground plus maybe another ½ an inch or something like that. One of the things that happens with onions is that they will end up actually kind of bulging out of the ground once they're fully bulbed out, when they're ready to pick. They're going to actually be sticking out of the ground a little bit. That's normal. That's not to be worried about. You don't want to plant them real deep though. So really just get the bulb in there, plus maybe another ½ inch or so.
Very good. Gail asks, do you use the red trays for tomatoes when you plant in the garden? Your trays all look black to me, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what red trays are, so I guess I don't know either.
Yeah. So Gail, you can, if you're still with us, just give us a little more information so we can understand that. Lisa asks, is there an advantage to having separate walls of water for each seedling or having a plastic cover for the whole bed?
I would think that the walls of water would do better. It's very localized and it's very concentrated. If you do the whole thing, you're going to have hot spots, cold spots, whatever you're going to have there, and it's more difficult to maintain as well. You got to keep it tented up over the seedlings. You don't want the frost cloth or whatever sitting right on the ceiling. You want to have it tented up over, so you're going to have some kind of supports to hold it up. A hoop house would be the ideal thing there. And if you had that, then that would actually work pretty well. But again, it would be cold down at the bottom and warm at the top from your light bulb over the nighttime.
Right. So these are going to be specific for your big producers, your tomatoes, your peppers, so that you really get that one plant to be an excellent, producer for you. Right. And the other advantage of the walls of water is the water, because it takes a lot of energy to freeze that water. And just having a plastic cover over the top, it might get a little bit actually colder. Okay. All right, back to the questions here. Where'd we leave off? Okay, Jamie, what would be an ideal temperature for a heat pad or room for seedlings? So do you know what temperature those heat pads go to?
I can tell you, I measured mine last winter for the first time. I had never actually done it before. And they were pretty darn hot. Mine do not have the thermostats. They're the cheaper ones to buy, and it was pretty hot. It was up in the 85, even to 90 kind of degree temperature range for that soil medium, and it works just fine. I am doing some with some friends for this spring. We've started some stuff down in Geisela, and his heating pads have a thermocouple on it, that is to say a thermostat, and he's keeping his at around 70 to 75, and they're working just fine. So anywhere in there is going to work well.
Very good. Jane asked, do you plant your tomatoes in different spots in your garden year after year?
Well, I have several raised beds, and so the answer is yes. I do rotate the crop. So I move, one raised bed will have the tomatoes this year, the next raised bed will have it next year, and right on around I have 7 of them, so I just rotate right on around. Good idea to rotate your crops.
Rotate those tomatoes, easy to get a tomato disease in. Yeah. Crystal asks, all of my plants seem to take 3 times what they should to grow. Crystal, that's me. Yeah. Are there any common mistakes that this might be causing this?
Yeah, that kind of falls into the watched pot never boils category there. Everything always takes longer than you think. When you have an injury, it takes a long time to heal because it's your injury. It's just that way. So yeah, you just need to be sure you're paying attention to the basics there, keep things warm, keep using the right soils and that kind of thing, doing all that stuff. It may just be your apprehension about it as opposed to reality.
And temperature really does make a difference. Like I say, if you start that winter garden too late, they just stay like that until it warms up. Yep. But if you get it in early, then you can have some good success. So that's important. And then using your compost and having a rich soil. Just a couple of things I think of.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, BD says, do you have any experience or recommendations about lasagna layering of the soil?
I've not done the lasagna layering for a garden. I have tried it for composting, but I have a neighbor who is an avid believer in it, and he has the best garden in the neighborhood. So I have to say it works.
Well, maybe we'll need to talk with him and bring him onto the show sometime.
He would be a really good, he'd be a real good speaker.
Cool. A lot of people, that lasagna gardening, we like the name of it.
Yep.
Kim asks, are there specific plants that should not be inside a greenhouse covering?
Well, I've not run across that one so far. So I guess I can't advise on that one.
I think you can put anything inside your greenhouse covering. There's some plants that it just probably isn't necessary to do it, is probably the answer. You know, so some of your plants you're going to plant directly, your squash and so on, you can just put them in the ground, but it's always a good opportunity to get them up started early. Linda says she planted corn and pine last year from a commercial seed, didn't get a great yield, did not get enough to blanch and freeze some. It was a first-year plot, hoping better next year. Yeah, so good luck. Just make sure you've got a lot of, I think a minimum planting size is important when you're growing corn because it's all wind pollinated. So I don't know what that is, if it's got to be 30 feet by 30 feet, but it needs to be large enough that they're getting fertilized, that they're germinating and pollinating.
You know, one of the tricks to corn is don't plant corn in rows. You want to plant corn in clusters. So rather than planting a row, plant it in a cluster. And that way, this guy is going to pollinate this guy, and they're all going to pollinate each other. If you've got them in a row, and the wind is blowing the other way, the wind just blows all the pollen away in the wrong direction. If you're in a cluster, you're going to get, some of the stuff's going to get pollinated regardless.
So a square or a circle, but not a row.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So Lisa says they have a greenhouse to get seedlings started, also have grow lights. How much are the grow lights needed given the light from the greenhouse ceiling?
If you have a greenhouse, meaning you get light from sun up to sundown in that greenhouse, you're going to do just fine. We're doing that down in Geisela right now, and it's working wonderfully.
So if you have a greenhouse, you should probably use your grow pad, but you don't need the grow lights.
You will need the heat, but you don't need the lights. That's right.
Okay, a little technical question from Margaret. Margaret, there is a unique Zoom link for every webinar. So you'll need to be on my mailing list or go to my website and find that for each of the programs. So help you out there. Crystal comes back. She's already, she's done the evaluation, had some ideas for me. Thank you, Crystal. I think we're starting to wind down here, Rich. What are the crops you rotate with the tomato beds?
I plant every summer. I'll plant tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and seems there's one other item there. And so every year I'm just kind of rotating them right on around with, you know, from one bed to the next, to the next, to the next. So I rotate them all in order. So they just keep on going around. So that works out really well.
So kind of like, okay, so anyway, you're switching them up off as the years go by. So got it. And Crystal just came back to talk about her broccoli plants taking months longer than she thinks. So she'll need to do more research. And Crystal, do reach out to your local master gardeners and cooperative extension agent, and maybe they can key you in on what is on your situation.
Chris hit on it earlier there. If you're planting your broccoli and you planted it kind of late in the fall, it's going to be slow. It's going to be painfully slow. Mine, I put some in that way this year as well. I planted some early and I planted some a little bit late. That late stuff is a couple of them have died and they're not doing all that well. But once the weather warms up, they're going to do much better.
Okay, and back with Kathleen in the lasagna technique using unfinished compost. Any problems you've had with unfinished compost?
I've never had any troubles with that. I tend not to use unfinished compost, but as I mentioned, this other neighbor of mine who does that lasagna thing all the time, he uses composted horse manure that he doesn't add anything else to it. He just ages the compost, lets it stay in a big pile and runs it for almost a year. And he uses that stuff straight and it works fabulously for him.
So, yep, anyway, good. Bill or William Maines says a 5x5 or 10x10 works in a small garden. I don't know if he's talking about corn, but I think 555 would be much too small. But anyway, another question is rotation in a specific order. Okay, we're back to that rotation here. So peppers before zooks, then tomatoes, then anything before the tomato, peppers, or more random.
Yeah, well, my rotation is in an order, but there is a proper order for doing that kind of stuff. The heavy feeders versus the, nitrogen fixers and that kind of stuff. And I have not gotten myself organized enough to make all that just right. And so whatever I do, it just seems to work. And eventually I'll get that in the proper order. But no, I don't really do a specific order, except that I keep it all going together. Peppers and tomatoes, peppers and tomatoes, peppers and tomatoes, right on down the line with the different beds.
And those are your heavy feeders.
Yeah, those are heavy feeders.
Okay. And William Maines just confirms he's talking about the corn, and they're saying the 5x5 worked in Chino Valley, but the 10x10 worked better. Yeah, there's a critical mass you need for the corn to be able to pollinate and get that wind pollination. So 10x10 sounds great. Okay, we're back over to the question and answer group. Some of them are repeated questions. Okay, so Gail, red tomato enhancing trays go on the ground, have a slot in the middle for the stem, has 4 holes in the bottom for water to seep into. So just, I guess, a little bit of technology there for a tomato tray.
Yeah, it sounds over my head, beyond me.
I'm sure it works nicely. And Kim is asking, when should I start an artichoke plant? Mine did not grow into anything last year.
Yeah, artichokes I'm totally unfamiliar with. Never grown them.
I think as it warms up, it's a good time to get artichoke in the ground. Artichoke is something that can handle the cool temperature. It does need a rich soil, and it will be a short-lived perennial, so it should come back each year. But if the gophers get underneath, they like them. So, and Dan says, so yeah, Kim, I think spring or even fall, when, like we were talking about that, August, September, they'll get started. Like I say, once you get them in, they tend to be a short-lived perennial. They'll keep coming back for a few years. And Dan asks, how often do you water new seedlings from the bottom? And do you ever water from the top using the hand sprayer?
I don't ever water from the top, but for the bottom watering, it's probably only about once a week. It might be a little bit more often, once the seedlings, are getting pretty good size. But yeah, that's about all you need.
You're in a cool site, and then the plants are small. You're just not using that much water. If it was later in the season where you might have a little more evaporation, but the soil and the plants should tell you. But once a week seems to be working well. And never spray from the top, because you might get your damping off, or other reasons.
Good thing to avoid.
Yeah. And Jane didn't get the answer about using B1 for transplanting.
Yeah, I don't use any of that miscellaneous stuff for that. I just, again, compost is my go-to thing, and so I be sure I have plenty of that in the soil. And that's all I do. And a little bit of organic fertilizer. I do put regular organic fertilizer in there as well. Not much, but a little.
So we're not recommending B1 is necessary for planting. It's supposed to help with it being cold and the shock, but really just the things he's doing to have a healthy plant going out there in the walls of water take the place. Much more success. Okay, I think we've exhausted our questions. And so one more, do you grow Swiss chard, and can you grow it all year long?
I do grow Swiss chard, and if the summer's not too hot, the chances are the Swiss chard is not going to bolt. And so yes, you will be able to grow it year round. If you have a hot summer, chances are it's going to bolt in the summer and you'll lose it. But yeah, Swiss chard is a great one. I love that.
Very good. Well, I'm going to close this down here. Rich, thank you so much for your time today. We've gone over a little bit, but as you can tell, everybody well engaged, lots of good questions. And I'm really grateful to have Rich and Payson helping me with the Master Gardener program, provides a great deal of leadership for us. And so as this COVID social distancing protocols start to come under control and we get our vaccinations, I look forward to getting active again and getting out into the community. So thank you, everybody. And hopefully see you again next week.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks everybody for joining.
Okay.